"She hasn't a thought worth hearing," the Duke of Rothwell said, and Verity Winslow, 3 feet away in the shade of a clipped yew, went very still, the way she had learned to go still years ago, so that a room might forget she was standing in it. She did not drop the tray of glasses balanced against her hip. She would remember that afterward, that her hands had not shaken, whatever else in her had. She did not yet know what that sentence would cost him to unsay, nor what it would cost her to go on hearing it repeated, in one form or another, for the length of a whole ruinous summer. Had she known, she would have gone on carrying the tray all the same, because that was the whole of her education, to be useful and to be unseen, and never, under any provocation, to be both at once. The party moved on around her, indifferent as a river around a stone. Lanterns had been strung the length of the terrace at Rothwell Court for the midsummer evening, and the heat of the day had not broken with the dark, but only settled lower, pressing against the silk and the starch like a hand laid flat on the chest. Mr. Edmund Cray stood at the Duke's elbow, immaculate in white linen, smelling of orange flower pomade gone a little too sweet in the warmth, and it was he who had asked the question that earned the answer. "Miss Winslow keeps remarkably neat accounts for a companion, I am told," Cray had said, turning his glass a precise quarter turn between 2 fingers. "One wonders what she makes of the rest of us." And the Duke, not looking at her, not looking, she understood later, precisely because he was looking at her too closely in his own mind to risk it, had said the sentence that would follow her the rest of the year. Verity set the tray down on the sideboard without a sound and went to see to the dowager's shawl, because that was a task. And tasks were a country she could always cross into and be safe. She had spent 6 years learning that a woman with no fortune and a ruined name attached to her, however faintly, however long ago, survived a great house only by being smaller than the furniture. She had made herself small. It had kept her fed, and it had kept her safe, and she had believed, until that evening, that this was the whole of the bargain. Her father had taught her figures the way other men taught their daughters music, patiently, at a shared desk, his pen scratching long columns while she watched the numbers resolve themselves under his hand like a held breath let out. Thomas Winslow had been land steward to the old Duke of Rothwell, and a good one, and it had not saved him. 10 years gone now, and she still could not walk certain corridors of that house without feeling the cold draft of what had happened to him move along the back of her neck, though she could not have named, that night, precisely why the draft was strongest nearest Mr. Cray. Something about him made her count the silver in her mind, though nothing was ever missing that anyone could point to. She was still refolding the dowager's shawl when a rider came up the drive at a pace no one brings news at unless the news is bad, and she watched, from the terrace steps, the Duke go to meet him, and watched his face. She had made a study of faces the way other women made a study of fashion plates, because faces did not lie to her the way voices sometimes did. And watched it go the particular still, flat gray of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the answer to. A letter was pressed into his hand. He read it once, and his jaw set, and something in his shoulders arranged itself for a weight it had evidently been expecting. "McCalmus," she heard him say, low, to no one, folding the paper along its old crease. 11 weeks. She did not know yet what waited at Michaelmas. She only knew, watching him, that whatever it was, he intended to carry it alone, the way he seemed to intend to carry everything alone, and that this, more than the insult, was the thing she would come to argue with him about longest. He looked up once before he went in, and his eyes found her on the terrace steps with the shawl still over her arm, and something crossed his face that was not quite apology, because a duke does not apologize to a companion for a sentence she was never meant to hear, but was near enough to it that she felt the whole width of the lawn between them collapse to nothing for the length of one held. breath before he turned and went inside to be, once again, entirely unreachable. She did not expect to be sent for. Companions were not sent for. They were assigned, adjusted, moved like the good furniture into whichever room needed filling. And yet the next morning, before the dew had properly lifted off the box hedges, the Dowager Duchess's maid found her in the linen room and told her, with the particular relish servants reserve for a companion's comeuppance, that His Grace required her in the estate office within the hour. Verity went. She had learned that going was always safer than wondering. The estate office at Rothwell Court smelled of leather bindings and the cold ash of a fire lit too rarely, and the Duke was standing at the tall window with his back to the door when she entered, his coat plain and dark and without ornament, his hands. She noticed this before she noticed anything else about him, because hands told her more than faces ever did, roughened across the knuckles in a way no duke's hands ought to be. "You heard what I said last night," he said without turning, and it was not a question, and she gave him the only answer she had ever found useful in that house. "Yes, Your Grace. I did not mean it as it sounded. It sounded," she said, setting her hands together in front of her the way she always did when a room grew dangerous, as though you meant it very precisely, in fact. That turned him. Whatever he had prepared to say, it was not that, and for a moment the gray eyes assessed her the way she was accustomed to being the one doing the assessing, and she found she did not care for it turned around on her. "Sit down, Miss Winslow," he said, and then, when she did not immediately, added, more quietly, "Please," as though the word cost him effort he was unused to spending. She sat. He told her, in the flat, disclaiming voice of a man laying terms rather than confessing a need, that the estate's books had not balanced for 3 years running, that the rents came in lean and left leaner, that he suspected error rather than accused anyone of worse, and that he required someone who could go through the ledgers line by line without setting the household talking, because a duke auditing his own steward's work was a scandal before it was even a fact. "I am told your father kept books for this family once," he said. "I am told you kept them with him." "My father," she said, and heard her own voice go careful, "was dismissed from this house for want of honest accounts, Your Grace. You are asking the daughter of a disgraced steward to go quietly through your ledgers. I am asking a woman I have watched read a room correctly from across a lawn," he said, "to do with figures what she already does without effort with faces." It was, she would think later, the nearest thing to a compliment he had given her, wrapped so tightly in business that she nearly missed it entirely. She named her terms, evenings only, after the Dowager retired, and no one else to know. Not yet. Not until there was something to know, and he agreed to all of it with a swiftness that told her he had expected to argue longer. When she rose to go, the Dowager Duchess herself was in the doorway, cane planted, eyebrows arriving a full second before the rest of her face did. "So you finally had the sense to ask her," Augusta said to her grandson, instead of scowling at the books as though sums were a personal insult. Miss Winslow's father could find a shilling in a snowstorm. "I dare say the daughter can find whatever's eating my grandson's rents. Grandmother, don't grandmother me. I am 71 and I have earned the right to say true things loudly." She turned her sharp old eyes on Verity, not unkindly. "He is going to be insufferable about this. He always is, when he's frightened, and won't say so. Go on, girl. Somebody in this house had better be sensible." Mr. Cray found her in the long gallery 3 days later, where she had gone to fetch a book for the Dowager and had lingered, as she often did, before the old Duke's portrait, wondering what her father had seen in that painted, unforgiving face that had made him serve it so faithfully. Cray's step on the boards was so light she did not hear him until he was beside her. "Winslow," he said, tasting the name. "It is not a common name. There was a Winslow kept the books here, once when I was hardly more than a boy sweeping ink blots for my keep." "Thomas Winslow. Any relation?" "My father," she said, and watched his face because that was the only defense she had ever owned, and saw nothing there but the mild, courteous interest of a man discussing weather. Nothing. Except that his hand, resting on the frame of a small side table, straightened it a precise half-inch, corner to corner, as though the world could not be born slightly askew. "A sad business," he said. "I remember it distressed his late Grace very much to be so deceived by a man he trusted. One does hope you have not inherited a taste for other people's figures, Miss Winslow." It was said so gently, with such a smile, that a listener 3 feet away would have called it kindness. "I have inherited his eye for them," she said, "which is a different thing." "Is it?" Cray said, and smiled again, and went on his way, and left her standing before the old Duke's portrait, with the distinct, cold sensation of having been weighed on a scale she could not see the numbers of. Word of her evenings in the estate office got about the servants' hall within the week, as such things always did, arriving at the drawing-room only slightly softened. Miss Vale, Honora Vale, an heiress newly arrived with her father's mill money and her own considerable polish, whom half the county had already married to the Duke in conversation, if not in fact, remarked at cards that it must be a great convenience, keeping one's bookkeeping and one's charity beneath the same roof, and smiled at Verity when she said it, the particular smile of a woman who has decided another woman is beneath the trouble of real cruelty. Verity said nothing, and wrote the exchange down that night in the plain marbled notebook she had kept since she was 11. The habit that had started as a child's game of watching people from doorways and grown, without her quite meaning it, into something she could not now stop doing any more than she could stop breathing. It was in the ledgers themselves, some nights later, bent over a column of tenant rents by a single candle, while the Duke read the facing page in silence across the desk, that she first saw it. A 7 on the entry for the Fens Cross Farm, closed at the top with a small extra stroke, a little flourish no one troubled to make, unless it had become, through long habit, entirely their own. She had seen that exact 7 before. She could not, that night, have said where. She only closed the ledger a little too quickly, and said nothing, and filed the thought away the way her father had taught her to file anything that did not yet add up, not forgotten, only waiting. The ledgers became, over the following weeks, a country the two of them governed together after the house had gone to bed, and Verity found that the estate office at midnight was a different room than the estate office at noon, quieter, warmer, lit gold rather than gray, and inhabited by a different man than the one who sat grave and correct at the head of his own dinner table. She discovered, by accident, that his hands were rough because he mended things himself. In the small hours, things a duke had no earthly need to mend. A cracked case clock in the gallery, a hinge on the chapel door, a child's rocking horse in the nursery that had belonged, she gathered without being told, to a brother who was no longer there to ride it. "You could send for a man from the village," she said one night, watching him set a tiny brass gear back into its housing with a patience that surprised her in so large a man. "I could," he agreed, not looking up. "My father sent for men from the village for everything. It is, I have found, easier to mend a clock than a great many other things, and a man likes to feel his hands are good for something. And are they? You are the second person in a fortnight to ask me that as though the answer were in doubt." But he was smiling when he said it, the smallest, most reluctant thing, more a rearrangement of his mouth than an actual smile. But she marked it, the way she marked everything, and thought, that is the first time. She did not say so aloud she had begun, without entirely deciding to, keeping a private ledger of her own beneath the household one, columns of small true things, the way he read the last line of a page twice before turning it, the way his voice dropped half a register when he spoke of his sister, the way he had not once, in 3 weeks, asked her a single question about her father that was not at its root. A kindness disguised as business. In return, she gave him what she had never given anyone in that house, an unguarded evening, an actual laugh at something dry he said about the vicar's sermon, and on a night when the work had run long and the candle had burned low, and something in the quiet had made confession feel less dangerous than usual, the true shape of what had happened to her father. Not the whole of it, not yet. Not the name she still could not fit to the 7 with its small extra stroke, but the bones of it. He kept an account of everything, she said. Every figure, in his own hand, always. He used to say an account that cannot bear the light was never a true account, and I thought it was only a thing fathers say to daughters, until I watched it be the whole of what was left to defend him and not be enough. What became of his books? Burned, most of them, when the debts came due after he died. I kept one. The last one he kept before he was dismissed. She had not meant to say that much. She saw him note it. She was learning to read his stillness the way he was learning, she suspected, to read hers. And he did not press her further, only said, quietly, I should like to see it. One day, if you would let me, and let the subject go, and she was grateful for it in a way that felt disturbingly like the beginning of trust. It was Cray who broke the quiet, 3 weeks before Michaelmas, at a dinner the Dowager had insisted upon to keep up appearances before the county, the Vale family present. Mr. Pratt, the family's solicitor down from London on some pretext of business, Lucy chattering about her spaniel's latest disgrace, and Cray, at the foot of the table, waiting, Verity understood afterward, for precisely this audience. It is remarkable, he said, into a lull, addressing the table at large with the mild, regretful air of a man raising an unpleasant subject only from duty, how history repeats its little patterns. 10 years ago, this house employed a steward named Winslow, who kept beautiful books, everyone said so, right up until the quarter, when £800 could not be accounted for and vanished with him into disgrace. I confess I had not thought of it in years, until I learned we had, once again, a Winslow keeping close company with the Rothwell ledgers, late at night, alone with his grace. The table went very still, the particular stillness Verity had spent her whole life learning to survive inside of, except that this time it was aimed at her, every face turned, weighing, and she felt the old instinct rise in her to make herself smaller, to apologize for existing in the room at all. Julian's hand, she saw, had gone flat and white-knuckled against the cloth. That is my father you are naming, Mr. Cray, she said, and was proud, afterward, that her voice did not shake even though her hands, beneath the table, had closed into fists so tight her nails left marks. A man cleared of nothing because he died before the clearing could be done, which is not the same as a man guilty. Of course not, Cray said, gentle as milk. I meant no accusation, only an observation. It was Julian who ended the dinner early, and Julian who came to her in the corridor afterward, his face set in the particular grave stillness she had learned, meant he had already decided something without consulting her. You will not go back to the estate office, he said. Not until this settles. I will not have you made the subject of that man's insinuations. You are removing me, she said slowly, to protect me. Yes, without asking whether I wished to be protected in that particular fashion. I am asking now. "You are informing me now," she said, "which is not the same thing, and you have done it before, Your Grace, if I recall, decided, on my behalf, in front of witnesses, precisely how much of a thought I was worth hearing." She saw that land, saw it land hard, saw something flinch behind the grave composure before it closed again like a door. "That is unjust." "It is accurate," she said, "which I have found, in this house, is very often mistaken for the same thing," and walked past him toward the stairs, leaving him standing in the candlelight with his hands, those rough, working, honest hands, hanging useless at his sides, because for once in his life there was nothing in front of him that could be mended with them. She did not sleep. She sat instead at the small writing table in her room, the one narrow luxury the dowager had permitted her, and took out her father's last day book. The one book of his she had saved from the burning, its calf cover soft and dark with handling, and read it through again by candlelight as she had read it 100 times before, searching, without quite admitting to herself what she searched for. It told her nothing new. It never had. Mr. Josiah Pratt found her the next morning in the little breakfast parlor before the household was properly stirring, and informed her, with the careful, apologetic correctness of a man who has been given an unwelcome office, that in light of certain concerns raised by Mr. Cray regarding the propriety and the history attaching to her presence near the family accounts, the trustees felt it best, pending the Michaelmas review, that Miss Winslow's evening duties in the estate office be discontinued, and that perhaps, he did not meet her eye as he said it, perhaps a small consideration might be arranged, a sum sufficient to establish her comfortably elsewhere, should she feel her position here had grown untenable. She understood, hearing it, that this was a bribe dressed in the language of kindness, that they were offering to pay her to disappear quietly before her father's ghost could embarrass anyone further, and she understood, too, with a clarity that steadied her more than it frightened her, that Cray had engineered the whole of it, using Julian's own fear for her as the lever. "You are very kind, Mr. Pratt," she said, "but I find I have not done anything requiring compensation, and I do not intend to begin accepting payment now for the crime of being my father's daughter. Miss Winslow, it would be considerably simpler. I am sure it would," she said. "I have observed that the simplest solution, in a house like this, is nearly always the one that costs the innocent party everything and the guilty party nothing. I will not make it that simple." She refused, and watched it cost her precisely what she had expected it to cost. Within the week, with the dowager away visiting a sick sister and unable to intervene, and with Julian closeted in London seeing to the bank on the very business the deadline had announced, the trustees quietly withdrew her position pending the Michaelmas review, and Verity Winslow packed the whole of her life into one trunk and one hatbox and left Rothwell Court in a hired gig, taking with her nothing of the houses except the memory of a rough, mending hand and a smile that had cost a grave man real effort, and the small, stubborn certainty buried under the hurt that she had been right to refuse, whatever it had cost her. The room she took in the village above the chandler's shop was small and smelled of tallow and rain, and she told herself, the first night in it, that this was simply the shape her life had always been meant to take. The interlude at Rothwell Court, a kindness she had mistaken for a beginning. She had been 3 days in that room, mending a hem by the window for want of anything better to do with her hands, when a knock came at her door so light she nearly mistook it for the rain, and opened it to find Simon Toole standing on the landing, cap wrung between his hands, a young clerk from the estate office she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in 3 months. His face gray with something that was not the weather. "I've done wrong, miss," he said, before she had even properly opened the door, "and I can't sleep for it, and I thought, "You were always fair to me, miss, when nobody else troubled to notice I was there. I thought you ought to know that Mr. Cray has had me copying figures these 2 years that weren't the figures I was given first, and I dared not say. For he knows things about my brother's debts he could ruin us with, and I don't know what to do with knowing it, only that I couldn't carry it alone another night." She brought him in, sat him by the small fire, and listened, and when he had gone, shivering with relief at having set the weight down even partially, she sat a long while with her father's daybook open on her knee, turning its pages by feel more than sight, until her thumb caught, as it had caught 1,000 times before without her marking it, on a slight thickness at the inside of the back cover, where the end paper had been pasted down a fraction less flush than a bookbinder would have left it. She worked her nail beneath the edge, gently, the way her father had taught her to work loose a stubborn knot rather than cut it, and the false leaf came away to reveal, folded flat and small against the true binding, 3 sheets of her father's closest hand, figures, dates, and beside one column, copied with painstaking care, a young clerk's 7, closed at the top with a small extra flourish, and beside it her father's own note. Dry even in disaster, this hand appears wherever the difference appears. I do not yet know the boy's name, only his mark. She sat a long time with the candle guttering, the little proof trembling faintly in her hand, and did not know, for the whole of that night, whether what she felt was triumph or grief, only that it was too large a thing to carry alone into a house that had already once told her she had not a thought worth hearing. The Dowager Duchess arrived at the chandler's shop 2 mornings later in her own carriage, unannounced, came first through the door, and did not so much greet Verity as annex her. "You will stop sulking in this appalling room," Augusta said, taking in the tallow smell and the narrow bed with an expression of frank disgust, "and you will come back with me, because my grandson has spent 4 days looking like a man who has mislaid his own hands, and because I have had quite enough of Edmund Cray's smiling face at my table, and because," she added, more gently, setting one gloved hand briefly over Verity's, "your father did not raise a coward, whatever this house did to him afterward. And I will not watch his daughter behave like one now." Verity showed her the folded leaf. Augusta read it twice, her face going, by degrees, from irritation to something flinty and old and entirely without mercy. "My Kelmus is in 4 days," she said. "Pratt will be here for the quarter review whether Edmund likes the guest list or not. You will bring this, and you will bring that ledger, and you will stand in the middle of my drawing room and say what you know, in the light, in front of every witness I can gather, because I did not survive 50 years of marriage to a difficult man, to watch a good girl talked out of the truth by a prettier voice than hers." It was, Verity thought, very near the doctrine her father had lived and died by, though he had never said it in quite those words, that the only safe way through was the plain way, through the middle, in the light, with witnesses to hold it steady. Julian came to her that same afternoon, having ridden the whole way from London on hearing his grandmother's message, and found her in the chandler's parlor with the daybook open on the table before her, and did not, for once, begin with anything grave or managed. "I was wrong to decide for you," he said, before she could speak. "I have had a great deal of road to think about it, and I find I have been deciding things for the people I care for since the day my brother died, because deciding felt safer than trusting anyone else to survive the deciding, and it has cost me the one thing I most did not wish to lose, which is you thinking well of me. I am not interested in apologies bought at speed, Your Grace," she said, though something in her chest had already begun, treacherously, to loosen. "I am interested in whether you intend, at my Kelmus, to let me stand in that room and speak for myself." "I intend," he said, "to stand beside you while you do it, which, I am told, is a difficult lesson for a man who has only ever learned to stand in front. Cray, unknowing that the ground beneath him had already shifted, was seen by two under-housemates that same week carrying a bundle of ledgers toward the estate fire on a night far too warm for any legitimate burning, and thinking better of it only when Simon Tull, newly steadied by having confessed the worst of himself to someone who had not flinched from it, refused, for the first time in 2 years, to fetch the tinder. Michaelmas morning came in gray and still, the heat of the summer finally broken by a rain that had fallen most of the night and left the gravel drive dark and the box hedges dripping, and the long drawing room at Rothwell Court filled by 10 o'clock, with more witnesses than any quarter-day review had ever troubled to gather before, the dowager enthroned by the cold hearth, Mr. Pratt at the writing table with his spectacles and his ledgers of record, Lucy holding her spaniel's collar because the animal had taken one look at Mr. Cray's polished boots and begun, low in its throat, to growl, Honora Vale seated near the window with her hands folded too tightly for a woman merely bored, and Julian standing, not behind his desk as he would once have done, but beside a plain chair set for Verity, close enough that when her hand trembled once, setting the daybook on the table, his own came to rest, briefly, against the small of her back, unseen by anyone but felt by her entirely. "We are here," Pratt said, "to review the quarter's accounts against the estate's obligations, in particular the note falling due at the bank this week. Mr. Cray, I understand you have prepared the figures." "As always," Cray said, and smiled, and set down his own neat folder, corner squared precisely with the table's edge. It was Verity who spoke next, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that her voice did not shake. "Before the figures are read, Mr. Pratt, I should like the room to see 2 documents side by side." She opened her father's daybook to the false leaf and laid it beside the current year's rent roll, open to the entry for Fenn's Cross, and asked Mr. Pratt himself to hold both to the window light, because she had learned long ago that a claim believed only on her word was a claim half-made, and a claim held up to the plain gray daylight and measured by an honest stranger's own eyes was a different thing entirely. "You will observe," she said, the numeral 7, in both hands, closed at the top with the same small extra stroke, a mark my father noted 10 years ago as belonging to a young clerk whose name he had not yet learned, and which appears this very quarter in an entry Mr. Cray has signed as his own honest record. The room's stillness changed register, the way air changes before a storm breaks. "A family resemblance in handwriting proves nothing," Cray said, evenly, though his hand had gone, she saw, very deliberately still upon the table, as though stillness itself might be willed into innocence. "Then perhaps," Verity said, "Mr. Tull can tell the room whose hand he was instructed to copy, and why." Simon Tull, standing near the door where he had been placed, gone the color of old paper, opened his mouth twice before anything came, and it was Julian, not Verity, who asked the one precise question that broke him open. Not did you falsify the books, which a frightened man could still find a way to deny, but, gently, Simon, whose debts were you protecting when you did it, yours or your brother's? And the boy's composure went at the mention of his brother the way ice goes at the first true warmth, and he told the whole of it, weeping, while the rain started again against the long windows, and Cray's letters to him, 3 of them, kept folded in the lining of the boy's coat against just such a day of reckoning as this one, for even a frightened man keeps proof against his master when he trusts nothing else, were read aloud into the stillness by Mr. Pratt's own steady voice. Each sentence in Cray's own careful hand, a small closing door. Cray did not shout, and did not deny it further, and something in his face, watching his own written words undo him, went, for one unguarded moment, into a grief so plain and so old that Verity, who had spent her whole life reading faces, read this one clearly. a boy who had swept ink blots for his keep, while another man's steward was trusted and beloved, and had decided, at some point too long ago to remember choosing it, that being feared was the nearest thing to being looked at that the world seemed willing to grant him. My father, Cray said, very low, to no one, was dismissed from a lesser house than this one for a debt of £11, and died owing it. I promised myself I would never again be the man asked to leave with nothing. And so you made certain another man left with nothing instead, Julian said, not unkindly, and called it justice, when it was only arithmetic done on the wrong side of the ledger. No one in that room called for the constable. It was the dowager, in the end, who set the terms, her old voice carrying the whole width of the drawing room, an annuity sufficient to keep him from want, on the single condition that he take ship for the Cape within the month and never set foot again on Rothwell land. The mercy extended, she said plainly, not for his sake, but for Lucy's, and for the name he had already cost one innocent family once, and would not be permitted to cost a second. Honora Vale rose then, quietly, and crossed to where Verity stood, and said, in a voice with none of its old polish left in it, I knew none of this, but I knew he pressed my father toward this match harder than any honest broker would, and I have been 3 months too much a coward to say I love a lieutenant with 400 a year instead of a duke with a mortgage, and I find, watching you, that I would rather be thought a fool for love than clever for fear, and Verity, who had once been the subject of that woman's careless cruelty at a card table, found she could not summon anything but sympathy for her, and took her hand. The garden at Rothwell Court had dried out by the 3rd week of October, and a single wren had taken up residence in the box hedge nearest the terrace steps, the same steps where Verity had once stood holding a dowager's shawl and heard herself declared unworthy of hearing, and it was there, on a mild gold afternoon, with the estate's debts settled. Her father's name formally and publicly cleared before the same trustees who had once let it be ruined, and Edmund Cray 3 weeks gone toward a ship, that Julian found her and did not begin, this time, with any business at all. I have nothing left to offer you by way of stakes, he said. The estate is solvent, your father is vindicated, Cray is gone, and I have no further use to press upon you, which I understand is the only honest condition under which I am permitted to ask you this. Marry me, Verity, because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take. You once told a room full of people I hadn't a thought worth hearing, she said, though she was already smiling, because the wren had begun, absurdly, to sing. I did, he said, and I have spent a great many weeks discovering it was the single greatest falsehood I have ever spoken, and that I intend to spend the whole of my life correcting it, one thought at a time, if you will let me. She let him. The wedding, when it came in November, was small and quiet, held in the estate chapel with its newly mended door, attended by perhaps 30 people, where the county had expected 300, and the dowager wept without the smallest attempt to disguise it, and pronounced the whole affair, between sobs, entirely too sensible for her taste. Simon Toole, pardoned and kept on at half the wage he deserved and twice the trust, wept harder. Honora Vale married her lieutenant the following spring in a wedding twice the size and half as happy, by her own cheerful admission, and wrote to Verity often. Mr. Pratt lived to a comfortable old age telling the story of the Michaelmas Review to any young clerk who would sit still for it, always ending on the numeral 7, as though it were the cleverest thing he had ever personally witnessed, rather than merely recorded. Her father's daybook was given a resting place at last in the estate library, under glass, beside a small brass plate bearing his name and the true dates of his service. The first thing any new steward at Rothwell Court was shown upon taking up the post. And in the following July, With the heat pressing down again on the box hedges and the lantern strung once more along the terrace for the midsummer party, a young debutante new to the county, not knowing any better, remarked within general hearing that she supposed a duchess, who had once been merely a companion, could have little of interest to say on any real subject. And the Duke of Rothwell, standing at his wife's shoulder with a glass in his mending, work-roughened hand, said, quite clearly, and quite without heat, that he had once made precisely that mistake himself, publicly, and had spent a year discovering that the woman beside him had more worth hearing in a single sentence than most men managed in a season, and that all London, if the girl cared to notice, had lately taken to quoting her book on the very subject of being underestimated. The wrens sang on in the hedge, unconcerned, and Verity, Duchess of Rothwell, who had once made herself small enough to survive a room, stood in the middle of it instead, and was heard. If this story warmed you, if some part of you has ever stood at the edge of a bright room being talked over, waiting to be asked what you actually thought, then come sit a while longer by this fire with me. The kettle's on, the chair by the hearth is kept for you, and I'd love to know in the comments which line stayed with you longest. The knock at the door in the dark, the 7 with its small betraying flourish, or the moment she finally stood in the middle of the room instead of its edges. If you'd like more evenings like this one, pull your chair a little closer and subscribe so there's always a place kept for you by the fire when the next story is told. Until then, be gentle with the overlooked ones in your own life, and be brave enough when it's your turn to make yourself heard.